The title of my presentation is Deep Ocean Industrialization, Climate Change, and Environmental Management of the Deep Sea. And for me to explain this, I want to first talk to you about what we know and how our understanding of the deep ocean has changed. I want to talk about how the deep ocean is rapidly being industrialized. There we go. How climate change is going to be affecting the deep ocean, and how this industrialization and climate change are going to come together in a way that really creates an urgent need for management of the deep ocean. All right, so let me begin. We're talking about the largest habitat on Earth, and I'm referring to the part of the ocean that's deeper than 200 meters. This comprises 2/3 of the planet's surface area, but far more, over 90% of the habitable volume on the planet. And because of this, and Chris, here we're having the automatic advance of my slides that I I was worried about. Can we try something to see that that doesn't happen? Well, let me see how this goes, but remember we were talking about not... The PC automatically advances Mac slides, let me just put it that way. And we had reduced that problem, but okay, just save it, yeah. Can you save it? Okay, we'll keep going. Okay, so because, oh, it's advancing, I can tell already. Because we have seen less than, because this is such a large area and so remote, we've seen less than 5% of the surface area of the planet. And as a result, less than 5% of the deep sea. As a result, most of the marine species in the deep ocean are undescribed. To some extent, this great depth in the deep sea goes to almost 11,000 meters. This has actually protected the deep sea because it's been so hard and so expensive to get there. And in fact, our measurement capabilities don't even extend to the deepest parts of the deep sea. If you think about it, we can't even measure pH right now in the deepest half of the ocean. We are in tremendous need of technological advance to explore the deep. So to try to help you understand what we do know now and why this change has been important, I want to take you back to the 1850s when the exploration of the deep ocean began. This is a great building to do this in because this building honors Prince Albert of Monaco and many of the great explorers of the deep sea. But the first 100 years of exploration was done from surface ships. And what emerged was the picture you see here of a very cold, dark, high-pressure environment. Scientists believed the deep sea was homogeneous, boring, covered with mud, stable, food-limited, basically a desert. But that picture has really changed over the last 40 to 50 years. We have developed a whole host of new exploration tools. You see some of them here, multi-beam sonar, acoustic tools. We have manned submarines, remotely operated vehicles, and all sorts of camera sleds and autonomous underwater vehicles. And we've now explored a much greater fraction of the deep sea with these, but not all of it, by far. And what has emerged is, in fact, a tremendously heterogeneous environment, not one homogeneously covered with mud. We've discovered a host of different sources of heterogeneity in the deep sea, and some of these are large-scale sources like water masses that produce features such as the oxygen minimum zones. Some of them, let me see if I can point here, covered by bacteria. I apologize, I'm gonna have to keep going back to capture my slides. Some of them, we have large nutrient-poor oligotrophic regions of the ocean covered with manganese nodules on the seafloor. We've discovered a tremendous amount of geomorphic and geochemical heterogeneity. We now know that the ocean is covered with hundreds of thousands of seamounts, many hundreds, thousands of canyons and fjords. We've discovered fluids coming up from inside the earth that are full of chemical energy that host chemosynthetic ecosystems. These rely on chemical energy rather than sunlight and photosynthesis. So we have hydrothermal vents. We have ecosystems reliant on methane seeps. And we have even biogenic habitats in the deep sea, whole ecosystems created of deep water coral reefs and deep water sponge reefs. So we now know the deep sea is very heterogeneous with many different kinds of ecosystems. But this knowledge has also brought the discovery of a host of different kinds of resources that people are now interested in. For example, we've discovered that many of the oxygen minimum zones support phosphorites, which people are now interested in mining for fertilizer. We've discovered that the manganese nodules have very high concentrations of nickel, cobalt, zinc, and other metals that we desire and are considering mining. We've discovered that seamounts are tremendous, these are underwater volcanoes, tremendous aggregation sites for fishes, and we've begun to harvest them in great numbers, for example, the orange roughy. We've also discovered that seamounts host cobalt crusts, which are rich in nickel, cobalt, manganese, and other precious minerals. We've discovered that our canyons are full of fish, and we fish them, but we've also found that they're repositories for organic matter, and that organic matter has led to huge deposits of oil and gas that we're now beginning to extract from our deep canyons. We've discovered that hydrothermal vents, in addition to all the really cool animals they have, precipitate massive sulfides that are full of gold and silver and copper and lead, and so we're interested in mining these. We've discovered that methane seeps with their many authigenic carbonate rocks are sites of aggregation for some commercially important fish, like the Patagonia toothfish in Chile. And we've discovered that all these cold water coral and sponge reefs are really important nursery grounds for many of the commercial fishes that we harvest. So you can see that we've discovered this heterogeneity as well as a wealth of resources. And we now recognize the deep ocean has a very large number of functions and services that we value. So I've just been talking about what we might call the provisioning services, things we can extract for resources we can extract for money, like fish and shellfish, oil and gas, and increasingly we're looking to the deep sea for pharmaceuticals and new industrial agents. And all those minerals I just told you about, we aren't mining them yet. We're just poised to mine them. I mentioned the deep support functions of the deep sea. So let's see, up here, if I can't even see my pointer anymore. Oops. Oh my goodness. Okay. So we recognize that these different deep sea environments provide habitat, food web support, refuge, and nursery grounds for those species we do harvest commercially and many others. The deep sea is very important for regulating services such as carbon sequestration and nutrient cycling, and we're starting to recognize biodiversity as a resource itself. There's a lot of interest in bioprospecting for genetic resources and for new biomaterials, but we also need to recognize that that biodiversity is the raw material that allows life to adapt to change in the ocean. We need to conserve that biodiversity. We also have scientific research as an important function in the ocean, or important service. The ocean is the space over which we lay our communication cables, and it's also been the source of much artistic inspiration. You can think of books going back to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Jules Verne, and film and art, all now coming from the deep ocean. But this is not a pristine environment anymore, and so we are experiencing what I call industrialization of the deep ocean. And this really comes from human population growth. Now, this image actually was shown by Michel Barange yesterday, but I've been using it for a long time. When I was 5 years old, there were 3 billion people on this planet, and now there are well over 7 billion people and rising. And with this population growth, of course, has come a rise in carbon dioxide. This is what we've been talking about for the last few days. But also, this population growth has led to a demand for more food, for more energy, for a huge amount of raw materials, and including rare earth elements. And all of this demand is leading us to deplete these resources on land and in the coastal zone, and then to head into deep water for these resources. And the reason we're able to get these things is really through advanced technology. So we now have satellites and new mapping tools. We have new kinds of fishing gear, new offshore infrastructure, and even new mining tools that are enabling us to move into deep water and grab resources. So what are we doing with these tools? Well, we're certainly fishing deeper and deeper every year. This figure shows increases with time in the depths of millions of tons of fish taken. And many of the deep water fish that we're taking are very long-lived fish. It's typical for deep sea fish to be over 100 years old. But of course, those fish are actually babies compared to the corals that sometimes are dragged up by those fishing trawls. The corals can be thousands of years old. And so all of these organisms grow and reproduce very slowly, which means they recover slowly from disturbance. So our fishing has many different kinds of consequences, and I think the most damaging is probably the loss of three-dimensional structure by bottom trawling. Scenes like this on seamounts often turn into piles of rubble after our trawls go through. I mentioned the fish are very long-lived, and this means that they're very easily overfished. We have a lot of lost fishing gear on the bottom of the deep sea, which continues to collect and kill fish long after the gear has been left. We have deep sea fishing causing endangered species simply as a result of bycatch. For example, the top 15 deep water fish in the Atlantic Ocean, 9 of them have become endangered, not because they're targeted fish species, but because they're bycatch. So fishing is one thing we're doing in deep water. We're also going deeper and deeper for our energy. And this is a map of the many thousands of oil rigs, they're not all shown here, but many in the Gulf of Mexico. And you can see there's that those that have been placed in the last couple of decades have all been in deep water. These are the big circles you see here. They're all in thousands of meters of water. And perhaps the most famous of these, right here, the Deepwater Horizon, is the one that spilled huge amounts of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. And we're just now learning what the consequences of this is. So obviously, deep energy comes at a cost. One of the things that's so ironic is that our advanced economies are one of the drivers of our demand for metals and rare minerals in deep water. So computers and electronics, for example, require huge amounts of nickel, gold, copper, and zinc. So do our cell phones and our iPads and so on. But also, kind of ironically, so does our advanced technology. So all the green technology like wind turbines and solar cells require neodymium and other rare earths. Again, because China has a lock on these, we're looking into deep water to mine these. So let me talk for just a second about deep water mining. I mentioned manganese nodules. There are vast areas of nodules right here off Mexico in the Carion Clipperton fracture zone. These are in international waters, and there are now 16 mining leases for polymetallic nodules by the many countries you see listed up here. And these claims are huge. This is 400 kilometers, so you can see many of these claims are several, 200-300 kilometers on a side. We're talking about very, very large areas leased for mining of nodules on the seafloor. There's also leasing going on of massive sulfides at hydrothermal vents for precious metal mining. And here you can see there's copper, lead, zinc, gold, and silver in these. So the Mid-Atlantic Ridge has been leased by France and Russia. The Southwest Indian Ridge has been leased, I think, by China and India. I'm not sure, I exactly remember. And then there's a lot of leasing going on within exclusive economic zones of many of the Western Pacific island countries, all to mine hydrothermal vents. There's also interest in mining phosphorites. I mentioned that they're a source of fertilizer. Phosphorites are common along productive margins all around the world, and there are 3 areas. Oops, I think I'm doing the pressing there. There are 3 areas that that there's actually now claims off of Namibia, Mexico, and New Zealand, though the New Zealand one's been turned down recently. But what's they all have in common is that they're in very, very productive areas with important fisheries that are important to the livelihoods of the people in those countries. And so there's automatically a conflict between the mining and the productive fisheries. It's advancing without me. Okay. And so just for an example off Namibia, the whole Benguela system, these fisheries, hake and horse mackerel, support the people, but they also support important bird and marine mammal populations. So we're not just taking things out of the ocean, we're putting things in the ocean. And there's a tremendous amount of waste disposal that's gone on in the deep sea. Early on, this took the form of dumping of radioactive waste and disposal of sewage. But this has now been banned by the London Dumping Convention. But there is a very important loophole, and that is the disposal of terrestrial mine tailings, which is still allowed in the deep sea. And it goes on in places as disparate as Norway and Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, and now Chile is thinking about doing this. So that's one source of disturbance. And then, of course, there's a tremendous amount of debris that ends up as a result of earthquakes and tsunamis and material coming down the river. So we're looking at another source of pressure. So you're probably thinking, well, what in the world does all of this have to do with climate change? That's what the topic is at hand here. And I guess I would argue that it's really all these sources of human disturbance are going to interact with climate stressors, which will reduce the tolerance and resilience of these deep sea ecosystems to these human pressures. So let me come back to climate again. And you've seen a little bit of these slides in my talk yesterday. We know that rising carbon dioxide is, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is entering the ocean and creating ocean acidification. It's also warming the atmosphere, which is warming the ocean. And that warmer ocean is, as a result, losing oxygen in several ways. First, because warmer water holds less oxygen, and second, because warmer water is more stratified, and it reduces the vertical mixing of oxygen from surface into the interior of the ocean. And so we are experiencing what we call ocean deoxygenation, and a decline of oxygen at bathyal depths, and also a shoaling of our naturally occurring oxygen minimum zones. And then we're also all of these factors are contributing to reduced POC flux, and so we have less food coming down into the deep sea. Now, if we look at a projection of climate change onto the seafloor, so this is now the deep sea floor, we find, and this is the result of probably 20 different climate models all being projected and averaged. In general, we find that most of the seafloor is warming. Most of the seafloor is losing oxygen. Most of the seafloor has reduced pH, and most of the seafloor is predicted to have reduced POC flux all by the end of this century. Now, there are exceptions. So the polar regions, you can see, are exceptions to all of this, and in a few cases, but not really. No, not the Southern Ocean. Mainly the high Arctic. So what are the consequences of these changes? I'd like to take a look now at what climate change might do in the deep ocean. And first, I want to just point out that while we don't have a lot of data, there are some good compilations that make it clear that the deep ocean has been warming. So this is a record of warming below 4,000 meters. You can see basically that most of the warming has occurred in the Southern Ocean. We don't actually know how organisms are responding to this. It's a small amount of warming, but I want to give you just one example of the kinds of changes that might be occurring. We know that in Antarctica, there has been an absence of large crustaceans, like the crabs you see here, because they're not tolerant of cold water. Well, the Palmer Deep has warmed above the crustacean threshold to greater than 1.4 degrees centigrade, and all of a sudden there's been an invasion of these lithodid crabs. So those areas, and they are voracious predators which have consumed huge numbers of invertebrates. those areas subject to crab invasion now have biodiversity patterns much, much lower than those areas where the crabs have not invaded. That's one example of the kinds of food web and structural changes that could result from warming. Another possible effect of warming is the dissociation of gas hydrates, and Paul mentioned this in his talk yesterday. We know that gas hydrates they're frozen methane. They line all of our margins. You can see all the known and inferred gas hydrates, and they're stable at high temperature and low temperature and high pressure. But when it warms, it will only take 3 degrees of warming to dissociate huge amounts of methane. This is thought to have happened in the past in geologic time, but we know they support methane seep communities. They lead to a lot of anaerobic methane oxidation, lots of sulfidic sediments. So what might this mean? Well, I think it's worth looking at where the greatest warming is predicted. Up here in the North Atlantic are also the places where we have the greatest bottom trawling, and I would argue that temperature stress may actually reduce, and the release of gas hydrates might reduce the resilience and inhibit recovery of bottom communities from that trawling disturbance. Let's take a look at pH changes. We don't have a lot of long-term pH records in the ocean, but there's good repeat hydrography data showing declines in pH in the North Pacific at bathyal depths. And also there are projections now that show declines or predict declines in pH in the North Atlantic in deep water as a result of drawdown of that CO2-rich water in the North Atlantic through deep water formation. It's pulled down to the south. And estimates are that something like 17 to 21% of the North Atlantic seafloor greater than 500 meters will experience a 0.2 unit drop in pH by 2100. And this is going to expose large numbers of seamounts and deep water coral reefs to high CO2 water with low aragonite saturation conditions. And just to give you some sense of what this might mean, if we look at the North Atlantic now, it's full of deep water coral reefs. They look something like this, highly calcified. If we look at the Eastern Pacific, where the aragonite saturation horizons are already very shallow, there's not much, there's actually very little in the way of calcified corals and no reef formation. 2 minutes, uh-oh, I better run along. Okay, so we are in a place where, has I really been done? Even with all of my technical problems? Okay. Okay, so we're in a place where we're looking at situations where the greatest drops in pH are the places where we're also trawling the most and where our deep water reefs are not going to be able to recover. I'm not really going to have time to talk much about oxygen, unfortunately. The hypoxia in the deep sea is also happening, and many of you folks heard about this yesterday. And we know that there are many different kinds of consequences of hypoxia, from our studies of naturally occurring oxygen minimum zones, altered size structure, diversity shifts, reduced colonization, reduced bioturbation. We have habitat compression as a result from hypoxia, with many of the plankton species that migrate daily being compressed into deep water and subject to greater predation. We have ground fish being subject to habitat compression and losing something like half of their area. Along the Northeast Pacific, we have invertebrates also experiencing something very similar. I'm going to skip over this next example, which was some of my own data that talked about, this is, I'm just going to skip this. It was an example of how we could look at multiple stressors interacting together through variance partitioning tools. And I'm going to, many of you saw this yesterday, the fact that we have multiple stressors interacting with many different kinds of human activities that I've talked about. So I'm going to spend the last couple of minutes just giving you some take-home messages and talk about the need for stewardship. I think we understand now that deep sea biodiversity will be subject to warming, acidification, and deoxygenation, but we don't know how those are going to interact. We do recognize that we need to recognize climate change as a cumulative impact that interacts not only among those environmental stressors, but with human activities. I think we desperately need some more deep water observations to target those regions that are at the nexus of climate change and deep ocean industrialization. And we need to begin to promote holistic environmental planning and management in the deep sea. I think we're faced at this point with how society should balance the use of deep ocean resources with the need to maintain the integrity of deep ocean ecosystems for future generations. And really to address this, we formed the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative. Some of you have heard of this. And the goals are really to promote scientific research and observation, to try to rectify some of the governance gaps in the deep sea that I didn't have time to talk about. We are focused on ecosystem-based management strategies, engaging stakeholders and the different kinds of expertise needed to address these problems, and in capacity building, assisting developing nations with managing their own deep ocean resources. And with that, I will stop. Thank you.